If you think about how backwards our industry is, we're waiting for somebody to decide they're ready to pull the trigger or almost to come into the unit showroom before we'll actually engage in a serious conversation with them. As opposed to engaging everybody who's into the 2.88% of the motorcycle industry. You sit here and you talk about rider education classes. Anybody in here doing some version of a rider education class, or you've outsourced it that it's happening in your parking lot? Who runs it, Tommy? So you have a third party coming in and running that for you. Typically the conversion rate between they graduated from the class and they bought a bike from our dealership is roughly about 30% around the country. 10 people in the class, 3 of them will pull the trigger. I got a guy who's at 80% conversion rate. You know how he does it? Puts a sales guy in the class, takes the class, not just gives a presentation at the class. There's a sales guy who takes the class every class. You know why? Because it gives me 3 days to get to know everybody in the class. I'm not here to sell you anything. I'm just developing relationships with everybody in the class. And 80% of them pull the trigger on a bike. It's that kind of thinking that causes more bike sales to happen. It's not a new closing line or word track.
And we kind of do that. Like if you buy a bike from us, you got to set the starter program or whatever. You buy a bike from us, bring that back and the bike for it, send it back and stuff like that.
That's awesome. I bought my daughter 7 years old, and I bought her, actually I didn't buy her a bicycle. She's one of those late to the party kind of things. To your point, I'm trying to get her, like she really likes football, and she thinks she likes that because dad likes that, right? But I love bicycles, and I love bicycle racing and riding and all this kind of stuff, and I've been trying to get her into bicycles forever, and I was just thinking, like when I was a kid, man, that was freedom. You get your first bike, that was freedom, and she's just like, You know, and so I got her all these secondhand bikes. I've got like 3 of them. One without pedals, and so she can strider it and push it, and I don't know. It just never has clicked. She thinks she likes it, but she never clicked. And then I go into my local bike shop, and I was getting my bike worked on, and I turn around, and she's ripping it around the store on this little Trek bicycle. I'm like, where did this come from? She's like, I don't know, it just feels right. She couldn't explain why that bike was better or different than the one at home. And of course, in my brain, I'm like, well, I got to get that bike, right? But I don't want to be that parent that just buys it. I want her to earn it and understand money and all this kind of stuff. So it's a $200 kid's bike. I put $100 down, and she's been making payments on it. She does stuff around the house. She earns money, and she paid it off about a month and a half ago. So she has this bike. But you know, kids grow fast. And now that bike is too little. So it took her about 7 months to get all the money to pay for the dang thing. And so now the bike is little, but there's a program they have at that store, which is a guaranteed buyback program. You get 60% of the retail value towards the credit of your next one. So you trade in the bike, and guess where your bike goes? Into the used bike department. They sell little kids used bikes. So they make money on the used bikes. You get 60% of retail credit towards the next bike, and you can trade up 3 times for the kids' bikes. That's causing sales to happen. Not hoping for, not waiting for, not reacting to. That's the kind of thing that we're looking for, right? How can we as an industry look to cause more deals to happen from all the departments? That's what this 20 Club thing's all about. You come into this 20 Club and you got 20 non-competing dealers, all with their own different ideas of how to move the needle. There's some great stuff that comes out of that. Transactions tell us how many we missed. Then you go about where are they and how do we capture them? And the reality is they're just in the other departments. The aha revelation that most dealers have is that the sales department must get into the other departments. Get out of the unit sales department, go hang out in clothing, go hang out in parts, go hang out in the service department. They have an obligation to get in those departments, just as the other departments have an obligation to look for sales into that piece. That's that whole quantifiable thing. We know quantifiably, and that leads into the conversation that I was talking about before with bicycle racing, that whole 14-year era of Lance Armstrong. Forget your opinion of Lance Armstrong. He was racing and doping during an era where 99.9% of everybody was doping. 99.9% of them all were doing it. And all you have to do is go back and look at what they did was they banked the blood from the winners. They didn't even have the test available. They went back years later once the test was available and retested the blood of all the people who were winning. You know, they either placed first, second, or third on some of these major races. Every single name that you can think of in the upper echelons of professional racing got docked with a 2-year suspension. All of them, every one of them. They got kicked out, they got the title revoked, they got Lance is just the one that you know about because it was the public thing that he got his 7 Tour de France titles pulled. You sit there and you think about the beauty that is bicycle racing, and I'll tell you what, it's the second watch sport in the world. Just because we in America don't traditionally watch bicycle racing is the second most watched sport in the world, second only to soccer. Okay? If you ever watch Tour de France, it's happening right now. If you ever turn the channel on, you're going to see these guys for 21 days racing 100+ miles with crowds 5 deep over hundreds of miles watching every stage of this race. In Europe, it's a huge thing, and people have an utter romance with the Tour de France, in particular that race, but bicycle racing in general. And a lot of it just has to do with the fact that 95% of all power put into the pedals transfers into propulsion. So as a mechanical unit, there is no more efficient machine ever built than a bicycle. So people have a true romance with bicycles just for that, not to mention bicycle racing and history, and you're rolling through these beautiful countrysides in France. And there's all these stories as these guys go through the towns. They tell the stories of every town they go through. So there's a romantic side of bicycle racing. And then there's the data side of bicycle racing. And what I find fascinating about that whole era is that they could pinpoint, they could with mathematical certainty tell you who was going to win that stage. Barring a crash, barring any unforeseen event, they can tell you exactly who was going to win that stage. Lance Armstrong knew he was going to win the Tour all 7 years because there's something called a hematocrit level, which is the amount of oxygen going through your blood. And at the point where your hematocrit is north of 50, which is it's just the arbitrary number. Most elite level cyclists are between 30 and 40. That's how fast the oxygen goes through your blood to clear out the lactic acid. Once you get north of 50, you had help getting there. Help being a syringe, help being a blood transfusion, help being EPO or any of the common things that got you there. So what they did was when they did the drug testing, they just said if your hematocrit level is north of 50, then you've been tapped with doping and you get a 2-year suspension. So the game for 14 years was, how do I get my level to 49.9 on race day and not trigger the 50? That's it. And Lance and Team Postal were better than any other team out there. They had more sophisticated ways. They had a guy on a motorcycle who would carry refrigerated saddlebags with their EPO and their blood transfusions in it. And there are moments where the tour bus would stop and they'd say, we have a mechanical breakdown on the tour bus as they're traveling from one stage to the next, so that all the guys in the team would lay down and do a blood transfusion in the middle of the road. They were brilliant at it, right? And so all this has come out in so many different books, but what I'm fascinated by is the romantic side of it and the data side of it that could predict with absolute certainty what was going to happen as a result. And I think about the motorcycle industry, then I think about the romantic side of the motorcycle industry and the composite and the transactional data, and we can tell you with mathematical certainty exactly how much money that store should have made, exactly how many units that store should have delivered, exactly what your parts and accessories margin should have been. If you do X, Y, and Z, this will be the outcome. It's fascinating to me, and it's not meant to remove the romantic side of changing someone's life and getting on a motorcycle. It's meant to go right along with it so that we can run a profitable business, remembering that what we do is change lives over here on this side of the fence. Does that make sense? It's just I almost wish they'd let doping happen. Because it's just much more interesting to see all the data and the charts and stuff like that, as far as I'm concerned. But that's how we get to what we do as a company, what our company does. Ed Lemko, my mentor in the industry, he was one of the first guys to ever take data and start tracking dealers and putting us in a room and saying, how are you doing that? Oh, that's really good, we should do that. And that became the best practice until something else came along that was better, that mathematically proved that that was a better plan and had a feeling with the customer that that was the right thing to do, okay? So we would implement that strategy, and all of a sudden these best practices would percolate to the top. This has been since 1981. We've been running these 20 clubs, okay? We know what works in a motorcycle industry. And I personally come at it from 2 very different angles. I'm on bike number 88 in my garage. If that gives you any idea of my obsession with motorcycles. I have a love affair with motorcycles, nothing else. I grew up water skiing, but I was allowed to water ski in Florida, so I didn't crave it. I wasn't allowed to own a motorcycle, and I think like any kid, the thing you're not allowed to have is the thing that you want more than anything. That clearly backfired on my parents, right? But I'm not a car guy, I'm not a boat guy, I'm not an anything guy. I'm a motorcycle fan. I love all of them. So I have a very unique perspective in that I play in the industry from a business person and a consultant, and I work with a lot of manufacturers. And then I also look at, well, how would that make me feel as a consumer? When I go in and buy my next bike, how do I feel? And that sucked, and so how do we change that best practice to accommodate for the fact that that sucked over here? So I'm always toggling between these two pieces. Ed Lemko wanted to retire in 2005, and I wanted to buy the business from him, but I didn't have the checkbook to pull it off, but the guys from Ride Now did. Ride Now has 38 dealerships across the Southern Belt, and they used our management programs to train up their team, buy another store, and plug them in. Train up the next round, buy another store, plug them in. That's how they got to 38 dealerships, and they had a vested interest to make sure the company continued, right? So I told them, I said, you stroke the check, I'll run it, and I'll buy back ownership from you. And that's exactly what happened in 2005, which is we shot a whole bunch of videos. We changed the name of the company from Lemko, Ed Lemko, my mentor, to the RPM Group, Retail Power Sports Management Group. Some of you have probably seen some of those training videos that we shot in 04 with a tachometer that went across the screen. We shot some more in 05 and some more in 06. 2007, we sold the company to Assurant, which is a third-party F&I provider, right? They were very